My parents called my wedding a waste, but fate had other plans. I always knew my parents didn't approve of my choices, but I never thought they would go so far as to completely erase one of the most important days of my life. Even now, when I close my eyes and try to recall the warmth of that day, I feel a cold, bitter wind sweep through my chest, reminding me that my happiness was nothing more than a waste of money in their eyes. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. But for them, it always had to be. They were the kind of people who counted every dime, not because they had to, but because they enjoyed the control it gave them. My father, Orrin, had always been pragmatic to the point of cruelty, and my mother, Helena, had never dared to defy him. They were a unit, a fortress of frugality and criticism, standing firm against anything that did not fit into their narrow vision of necessity. I can still hear my mother's voice when I first told her I was getting married, not in excitement, not in joy, but in sheer, exhausted disappointment. And how much is that going to cost you? Not who is she? Or are you happy? Just a number, a transaction, another foolish expenditure I was making against their better judgment. She didn't even bother pretending to care. My father barely looked up from his newspaper. Dahlia, my wife, had never met two colder people in her life. She really tried, to win them over. She baked them bread from scratch when we invited them for dinner. She sent them Christmas cards with handwritten notes inside, hoping to strike even the smallest ember of warmth between them. She asked about my father's work, though he barely acknowledged her. She complimented my mother's garden, though Helena only sniffed and said the soil was poor this year. Nothing was ever good enough. Not for them and certainly not for me. So when the invitations went out, I had no illusions about their reaction. I half expected them to decline, but some stupid part of me, some neglected, desperate child inside, hoped they would surprise me. That for one day, just one day, they could put aside their disdain for my choices and pretend to be the parents I needed them to be. Their response came in the form of a curt email from my father's account, because even a phone call was too much effort. We won't be attending. Weddings are an unnecessary expense. Have a nice day. That was it. That was the entirety of my parents' response to the day I would vow my love and commitment to another person. To them, it was nothing. To me, it was everything. Dahlia tried to comfort me, but I could tell she was furious. She had grown up in a family where love was loud, where celebrations were treasured, where no event was too small to bring everyone together. Her parents had called immediately, bubbling with excitement, asking how they could help. Her father, Graham, even joked about wearing a ridiculous suit just to make our pictures more fun. Meanwhile, my parents couldn't be bothered to acknowledge my existence beyond an email that might as well have been an overdue bill notice. And yet, I still thought about them on my wedding day. As I stood at the altar, hands trembling, heart hammering, eyes locked on the most beautiful woman I had ever known, a part of me scanned the pews, looking for them. I knew they weren't there. I knew they never would be. But I searched anyway, like a fool, like the son they had molded me into, always hoping for what would never come. The ceremony was perfect. The reception was loud and joyful, full of music and laughter, of clinking glasses and drunken toasts. Dahlia glowed with happiness, and I tried, truly tried, to let it consume me. But when the night ended, when the lights dimmed and the last guests drifted away, I felt the weight of their absence settle onto my chest like a stone I could never remove. The worst part wasn't even that they hadn't come. It was that they had made me feel guilty for missing them, that I, on my wedding day, had wasted even a sliver of thought on whether they were at home, whether they had even remembered what day it was, whether they had laughed about it over dinner. Good thing we didn't go. What a waste that would have been. A month later, I received a package in the mail. No note, no return address, just a box neatly packed, filled with all the things I had left at their house over the years. Childhood books, old photographs, a few shirts I had forgotten about. It wasn't just a rejection of my wedding. It was a rejection of me. I stared at that box for a long time. Then, without opening it further, I shoved it into the back of the closet. I told myself I wouldn't let it bother me. But of course it did. Of course it always would. Because that's what parents do, right? They get inside you, deep into your bones, so no matter how far you run, no matter how much you build, you can never quite escape the shape of them. I had convinced myself that my parents' absence from my wedding was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. That, after the rejection, after the silent dismissal of one of the most important days of my life, I would finally be free of their grip on me. But that was the thing about Orrin and Helena. They didn't just disappear. Their disapproval wasn't loud. wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, seeping into the spaces between moments, lingering like a chill in the air. A few months after the wedding, I got another package. This time there was a note. Found this while cleaning. Figured you'd want it. The handwriting was my mother's, as sharp and impersonal as I remembered. Inside was a small wooden box, the one I had carved in high school. It had been an art class project, something I had spent weeks sanding and staining, trying to make perfect. At the time, I had given it to my parents, hoping they would keep something special inside it. When I was younger, I imagined it holding things like letters, family keepsakes, proof that I mattered to them. Instead, it was empty. Dahlia found me staring at it, my fingers tracing the worn edges. "Are you going to call them?" she asked gently. I shook my head. No point. They sent their message loud and clear. But the package had done its job. It had pulled me back into their orbit, if only in my mind. I told myself I didn't care, but late at night, when Dahlia was asleep beside me, I would stare at the ceiling and wonder, what were they thinking? Did they regret not coming? Did they talk about me when I wasn't there? Did they miss me at all? Dahlia, ever the optimist, suggested we try again. Just one dinner. Let's invite them. See if things can be different. Her parents had embraced me from the start, had called me their son-in-law with warmth that made my stomach ache. She wanted to believe mine could be the same. I didn't, but I agreed anyway. We invited them to dinner at our home, a small but cozy townhouse with a garden Dahlia had already filled with herbs and flowers. I sent a simple email. No pleading, no expectation. Just an invitation for a meal. My father didn't respond. My mother wrote back 2 days later. "We'll be there." I don't know what I expected, but when the night arrived, I wasn't prepared for how stiff and formal it felt. Oren and Helena arrived on time, empty-handed, as if this was an obligation, not an invitation. My mother barely looked at Dahlia, only giving her a tight-lipped nod. My father scanned the room, as if assessing how much we had spent furnishing it. "It's nice," he said at last, though it didn't sound like a compliment. Dinner was a slow, awkward thing. Dahlia tried to keep the conversation light, asking about my mother's garden, my father's work, but they answered in clipped responses, never returning the question. My mother barely touched the meal Dahlia had spent all day preparing. My father at least ate, though he made an offhand comment about how restaurants are easier. But it was when Dahlia excused herself to get dessert that things truly cracked open. "You should have waited," my father said, setting his fork down. I frowned. Waited for what? Marriage. You rushed into it. You're still young. These things don't last when you don't think them through. I felt something inside me snap. I thought it through just fine, Oren. We've been together for years. We love each other. I don't know why that's such a hard concept for you. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Love doesn't pay the bills. My mother, silent until then, finally spoke. It's just a lot of money, Alex. We're just being realistic. Realistic. That word had followed me my whole life. They had said it when I wanted to study art instead of finance. When I wanted to move out earlier than they deemed necessary. When I dared to have dreams beyond their narrow expectations. You didn't even come, I said, my voice hollow. You didn't even want to see. My mother sighed, pushing her plate away as if she were exhausted. We knew what we needed to know. Dahlia returned at that moment, carrying a pie she had baked from scratch. The warmth of it filled the room, but my parents were already getting up. We should go, my father said, barely looking at her. I didn't stop them. I didn't even walk them to the door. Dahlia stood beside me, watching as they left without so much as a goodbye. That was the last time I saw them for a while. No calls, no emails, no more packages. But I knew it wasn't over. My parents weren't the type to let things go. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending I didn't care. Months passed without a word from Oren and Helena. I told myself I was done, that I had finally given up hoping for something that would never come. But the silence wasn't relief. It was an absence, a void that sat in the background of my life, unnoticed until it was too heavy to ignore. Dahlia never pressured me to reach out again, but I saw the worry in her eyes. She wanted me to have what she had, a family that loved and supported each other. I just wasn't sure if that was even possible. Then, one evening, an unexpected email appeared in my inbox. It was from my mother. Your father has been having some health issues. Nothing urgent, but I thought you should know. That was it. No pleasantries, no apologies, just a simple notification, as if she were talking about the weather. I stared at the message for a long time. My father had always been a pillar. Stern, immovable, seemingly unaffected by time. The idea of him being unwell stirred something in me I wasn't prepared for. I hesitated, but eventually I responded. I'd like to see him. When I arrived at their house, the same house I had spent my childhood in, I felt like an intruder. Everything was the same. Too neat, too quiet, as if laughter had never lived there. My mother opened the door and gave me a quick once-over, as if she were assessing damage. "You look thin," she said. "I'm fine. Where's Dad?" Oren was in his chair by the window, a blanket draped over his legs. He looked smaller, weaker, as if something had chipped away at the man I once knew. He glanced up when I entered, and for the first time in my life, I saw something unfamiliar in his eyes, vulnerability. "Alex," he said. "Not you're here. Not it's good to see you. Just my name," but even that felt like a step forward. I sat across from him, unsure where to start. "Mom said you weren't feeling well." He waved a hand dismissively. "Doctors make a big deal out of everything." But my mother, standing behind him, looked different. There was something in her posture, in the way her hands twisted together, that told me she was afraid. I had never seen my mother afraid before. "You should have told me sooner," I said, looking at her. "I would have come." She hesitated. "We didn't know if you would want to." It was the first honest thing she had said to me in a long time. I looked at my father. "I know we don't see eye to eye on a lot of things, but you're still my parents. I'm still your son." Oren sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "We were hard on you," he admitted, the words slow, like they were unfamiliar to him. "We thought we were doing what was best. Preparing you. You prepared me for a world where love was a liability," I said. "But I don't live in that world. I don't want to." Silence stretched between us. Then, something shifted. "Your wife? She's good to you?" he asked. It was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging Dahlia as part of my life. "She is," I said. "She makes me better." He nodded slowly. "Maybe we should meet her again." The dinner invitation came a week later. This time they asked to come to our home. Dahlia, ever gracious, accepted without hesitation, though I could tell she was nervous for me. I was nervous too, but something was different this time. My mother brought a pie, something she had never done before. My father actually made small talk, commenting on the meal, on how we had decorated our home. He didn't criticize, didn't inspect every corner like he was looking for flaws. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As the evening went on, I caught my father watching me and Dahlia, a thoughtful expression on his face. And then, quietly, he said, "You did good, son." It was simple, but it was everything. Over time, things changed. Slowly but surely. They began inviting us over, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. My mother called more often, asked about our lives. My father, though still reserved, started sharing pieces of himself I had never seen before. Stories about his own struggles, his own fears. It was like meeting him for the first time. And I changed too. I let go of the anger I had carried for so long. I stopped waiting for them to be the parents I had always wanted and started accepting them for who they were. And in doing so, I found something I never thought I would: peace. Families aren't perfect. Parents make mistakes. So do sons. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that love isn't about perfection. It's about trying, again and again, even when it's hard. And for the first time in my life, I felt like we were finally trying together.